What's going on, everybody? Thanks for tuning back in to We the People podcast. I'm your host, Brett Maurer. Today, I'm joined by guest star Cole Holliday. He is a history major at Holy Cross College in Notre Dame, Indiana, and soon to be graduate with a history degree. Cole, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So, just so our viewers know, we are communicating through a socially distanced phone call. So the audio track may not be the greatest.
Right.
But so today our topic is going to be the kind of early parts of the War of 1812, and our main focus is going to be on the invasion of DC in 1814.
Mm-hmm.
So just to start off with a little background knowledge, 30 years after the War for Independence, Britain was at war with France. This was France under the rule of Napoleon. And
Correct.
basically, Britain decided to set up trade blockades that forced all trade vessels to have to pay some form of royalty or kind of like a toll to the British Crown in order to move through the blockade. And this included American ships. So, Cole, one of the questions I had for you was, how is this similar to events that happened during the Revolutionary War? I know we saw, you know, similar aspects of the British searching shipping vessels and requiring tolls and things. So how was this similar to those events in the Revolution, and what would the American response to that be?
Well, the way you see it is that, obviously the revolution started with, I would say the very beginning of it was probably maybe after the proclamation of 1763,
Mm-hmm.
which the British government prevented American settlers from moving westward past the Appalachians. Obviously, they weren't too happy about it, and ever since, the British government has been passing several acts like the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, whatever, that impose some heavy tax on the settlers so that they can pay off their war debts from the French and Indian War.
Right.
And once it got towards, I think, after the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party, that's when obviously the powder keg explodes.
Mm-hmm.
Because during that time, there's also times where British soldiers would raid people's homes and basically force them to let them settle in the house and take their food and other supplies. And obviously what kicked it off was the Battle of Lexington and Concord. So I think what the British do in the War of 1812 is practically the same thing they did on the mainland during the Revolution, when they would force themselves into people's homes, take all their supplies, and even burn them if they don't cooperate or pay tribute.
Yeah. Well, and I know moving on into maybe before the Revolution, but during the kind of precursors to the Revolution and the kind of era of the Sons of Liberty, I know there was some issues with smuggling, Madeira wine and things like that on ships. So there was a lot of trade vessels being searched and seized and things like that also.
Right.
So moving on from that, so we know the British forced American trade vessels to pay a toll, and obviously America was not happy about that.
Right.
Shortly after that, some ships would be searched and even have part of their crew taken and forced into service with the Royal Navy. And
Right.
I know something similar to that happened once again during the Revolution, when not only militia members and even just civilians, but also slaves were taken by British forces and forced into service. And later on in June of 1807, a British warship opened fire on an American naval vessel after they were denied the ability to search the ship for British deserters. So
that's when America officially declared war.
Yes, yep. A few years later in 1812, America would declare war with Britain. So I know something similar to that happened later on in American history with a couple different wars. But is there any historical similarities you draw to American ships being attacked and then, obviously America declares war soon after that?
Well, the only things I can think of is, I would say, like, the very beginning of the Spanish-American War. That's when an American ship is bombed in the harbor of Havana, if I'm not mistaken. And there was really no perpetrator that they could point to except for Spain. And that gave them enough reason to declare war and send troops to Cuba or even into the Philippines. And another time I would say maybe, even though it wasn't an American ship, it was a ship that contained Americans on it. It was a German U-boat prior to World War I that sunk a passenger ship. And it wasn't really until I think maybe a year or 2 years after that happened that America declared war on Germany when they intercepted a telegram that was being sent to Mexico.
That's interesting that you bring up World War I. That's actually the event that came to mind for me when I first learned about this. But I'd never heard that story about the Spanish-American War. That one is relatively new to me. So a ship was attacked by nobody knew who, and America just assumed it was Spain. Interesting. I'm going to have to.
They just like basically were already like getting angsty about it, and they really I think the real reason they blamed Spain was because they could basically kick Spain out, Cuba, Guam, the Philippines, and any other territories the Spanish Empire had at the time. It gives them the justification for it.
I'm definitely going to have to look more into that. I can honestly say the Spanish-American War is something that I don't know a ton about. It's kind of one of those things that has never really interested me a ton when it came to American history. I will definitely have to look into that. That's an interesting story. But
it was certainly a very short war for America,
right?
Because they were well equipped, well trained, and they had good military leadership when fighting the Spanish. Because the Spanish at this point, they were just a bleeding empire.
Right.
They didn't have much territories left, and after that, after the war, it pretty much just finished them. Well, and it made them have a, I want to say a revolution, but I'm not sure. I'll have to do more research, because eventually Spain becomes a republic.
Right.
Later on after the war.
Right. And actually that's what I was going to say. I thought that the Spanish-American War led Spain into their kind of war for independence. So that's really interesting. That's definitely something I'll have to look into. That may be a future podcast I'll have to have you back for.
Oh, yeah.
So moving on from there, obviously we said that America declared war with Britain in 1812. But there wasn't a ton of focus on that war. Britain, was still super focused on trying to stop Napoleon and his, spread of his empire, trying to stop his hold on the European mainland.
Because his empire already spread into Spain and even Italy, and it started making its way towards Poland and Russia.
Right, and
by this point,
we look back and we can always see who the aggressors and things are in different wars, but between the French and the British, there's always this kind of underlying idea that the British were these big bad guys that colonized the globe, and and that may be partially true, but had it not been for the British in this case, Napoleon may have taken control of most of the European countries.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, the citizens of France later on did not care for Napoleon or his descendants' empirical rule.
Yeah, that's very true.
So during this time that Britain is still fighting France, there were some minor naval battles between America and Britain, and that was pretty much the majority of the War of 1812, obviously until we get to 1814.
I was gonna say that a majority of the war was pretty much fought off the mainland in the Atlantic.
Yeah, that's very true. And even after it had reached mainland, it did not last long. I know they made landfall in America in, I think, August of 1814, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, that the war ended shortly after that, like maybe a month or two.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think from my research, their overall goal wasn't to gain territory or even control the White House. I think they just wanted to pretty much burn down Washington so they could, it's basically as an act of retaliation and to, get them out of Canada. Because I don't mean to jump the gun here, but I know at some point the American military was going up into Canada and raiding British towns, and that's what made them send ships over to the coast so that they can draw Americans out of Canada and make them focus on protecting their territory.
Right. Yeah, that's very true. The American forces did make multiple pushes into Canada, and actually the one that we will talk about here soon was over trading ports, just over the border in what is now present-day Toronto. So I think I definitely... Go ahead.
Okay. I was going to say one of the reasons for going to Washington was because of a important port, Port Dover. American troops raided that port, and that's what pushed the British to come down to Washington and burn it down.
Yeah, right. And you said something about this not being a land grab on behalf of Britain, and while I partially agree with that I don't think it was one of those, we're going to take control and hold it, because we did see that after, the invasion of Washington, they did move on to other cities. I think there's definitely always the goal of any war to obviously conquer the enemy, but we also have to remember, like you said, with the revolution, it all spawned because Britain had to pay off those debts from the 7 Years' War, from the French and Indian War. And as we know, the colonies were a major, major cash cow, making up a large percentage of Britain's economy at the time. And to lose that percentage of your economy while you're in another war with France and fighting that war well into 1814, I can only imagine that they're looking to take those colonies back, or now the United States back.
I would take more resources than what it's worth, because, I mean, the revolution, they poured so much resources into trying to maintain authority and control over the colonies.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, that didn't work in the end, because the Continental Army ended up getting support from the French Army and even the French Navy.
Right.
And that helped them. That pretty much helped them win Yorktown against Cornwallis.
Right. That's very true. And
not to mention, because of the war with Napoleon, that's already spreading their resources pretty thin.
Right. Right. And that's kind of my point there, is that obviously Britain and France both, because we have to remember France turned around after the revolution and had a small revolution of their own.
Right.
Small, obviously, being a quote unquote exaggerated word there.
Right.
But so, France themselves and Britain are both kind of spread thin when it comes to what they have available resource-wise.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, just getting back to 1812 and the naval battles that preceded from the declaration of war, there are a couple heavy hitters that kind of resonated with history that I wanted to just touch on. One of those battles occurred on the 19th of August in 1812. This was when the USS Constitution. So for those who don't know, the USS Constitution is the oldest currently commissioned warship in the world. And it has been in U.S. Naval Commission since its construction and has remained an active warship. In fact, it is still manned by United States naval sailors. And the big battle here on the 19th of August in 1812 was the U.S. Constitution versus the HMS Guerriere. And so the little bit of backstory there, the HMS Guerriere, obviously, Guerriere is a French word meaning warrior. This ship was actually a French ship that Britain had taken control of and put into their own military use. And right. And this battle between the USS Constitution and the Guerriere came just after a British squadron had failed to capture the Constitution. This was a small squadron of, if I'm not mistaken, 3 or 4 vessels. So it was a rather small naval fleet that the Constitution managed to escape. And on its way to Halifax, the Guerriere ran into the Constitution again. And so the Guerriere captain, thinking his power was more than it was, decided to take on the Constitution single-handedly. And this is when the USS Constitution got its famous nickname, Old Ironsides.
Yeah.
So, obviously, the USS Constitution destroying this well-known British vessel, sinking it and lighting the remains of the ship on fire as it sunk, taking its sailors prisoner. This was obviously a major morale booster for American forces, who at this point did not know much of what was going on in the war because it was mostly naval campaigns, but also they had been struggling against the British Navy.
Well, yeah, because history has always said that at one point in time, the Royal Navy was the most powerful navy in the world.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I know that the Royal Navy took some heavy hits, leaving the Revolutionary War. And I know France's navy became increasingly more powerful, but going into the War of 1812 and during the Napoleonic era, do we see Britain's naval strength returning? And is that maybe a reason why we see so few American victories in these naval campaigns?
The way I see it, I would say yeah, because obviously they're already at war with France, and that gives them the reason to rebuild their navy. Because the Royal Navy has always been like something they relied on,
right?
Whether it was like conquest of land, making colonies, like anything. Because of that, they didn't really heavily rely on other military branches because they knew the Navy would get the job done.
Right.
So, and plus, because of how fearsome they were, that's what made them think that sending Royal Navy ships to the Atlantic would make people pay toll or tribute for a rite of passage into France.
Right. And of course, that's not to say that Britain's other branches of military power were not strong. We know that...
no, they were very strong, including especially the Army, because they were pretty formidable in the early years of the Revolution.
Right. Yes.
Once we get more of an organized army instead of a militia, not to mention French support, that's when they get evenly matched.
Right, and it's definitely seen how formidable the normal infantry army was. But not only that, you also had the special battalions such as the Dragoons. You had the Queen's Rangers, who we know were an incredibly kind of feared and fearsome group. You also had the British Grenadiers and the Scottish battalions. So, I mean, all around, Britain was also, a military.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, all around, Britain definitely was a military power to be reckoned with.
Oh, certainly. They even also had the Hessians, who are like German mercenaries.
Right. So then, obviously, American sailors come home with this great victory, having destroyed the Guerriere, with their ship newly being nicknamed Ironsides. For those who don't know, the USS Constitution's nickname is Old Ironsides because during this battle, and the battle with the small battalion of naval vessels that attacked it earlier, the ship sustained quite little damage. It did sustain quite a bit of damage, but the damage was not as nearly severe as, say, the Guerriere, who was completely destroyed, burned, and sunk. And it is believed that because of the hard oak sides of the Constitution, that it is said that sailors saw the cannonballs bouncing off of the hull at some places. And so they said, her hull is made of iron. And they started calling her Old Ironsides. So obviously shortly after, we're skipping 2 years ahead. So 1812 naval battles commence until then. There is another small naval battle that became kind of important. This was June 1813 on the 1st of the month. The USS Chesapeake found itself in a skirmish with British naval vessels, and this is also known as the Battle of Boston Harbor. It ended up being that the USS Chesapeake was taken by British forces and ended up becoming a British warship for a short period of time.
Right.
So then moving forward from that, we finally hit 1814. And what we know is that in 1814, Napoleon finally abdicated the throne in France. Now, what did this abdication kind of mean for the rest of the world? I mean, we know that obviously with his abdication of the throne, that meant that somebody else would have to, rise to take the power, so to say. And we know that going into this, Napoleon had finally had his, major defeat that would lose him control of France. We know that the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, after, a short period later, would kind of be his final song when it came to trying to hold power. So what does Napoleon giving up the throne of Spain, France, sorry, not Spain, giving up France mean for the rest of the European countries?
Well, the way I see it, for Britain, I think that lays off a burden of theirs because, again, as we've been saying, they were already at war, and I think removing Napoleon from power might have ended the war, but it still brought tensions between the nations. And I guess it depends on if Britain had allies against France. My assumption is they did, and that I think it gives them time to rebuild the damage Napoleon wrought. But for Britain, I think a big important thing to point out is that it gives them time to maybe shift focus from France to America to see what more can be done regarding the war they're already fighting.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. You brought up the excuse me, I'm drawing a blank. You brought up the Allies, the UK, obviously Britain's allies against France during the Napoleonic era.
Called, the coalition forces, I believe.
Say that one more time.
I think they're called the coalition forces.
Okay. Yeah, again, this is another one of those periods that I don't really know a ton about. Napoleon, I've always kind of focused more on American history, and so when we have these crossovers between, French and English history with obviously the birth of our nation was very influenced by both of those nations, and is a major part of not only our history but theirs also. But with events like this, the Napoleonic Wars, and relations between the United Kingdom and France and things like that, I've never really followed it a ton. And so to hear kind of the deeper dive of these different subjects, it's interesting to me just because I do not know a ton about them. Do you know anything about the English allies during this period?
Not a whole lot, but I think, from what I understand, it was basically some rebel factions that were within France's held territories, like I think Spain, Italy, Germany, and maybe even Poland had some rebel factions. I know Russia was a big anti-Napoleon because obviously at some point Napoleon invades Russia, but to his mistake, it was during one of the rough winters of Russia. And a lot of French troops either starved, froze to death, whatever, and that's what made him retreat.
Yeah. Just as we were talking right here, I have a book sitting here next to me that includes some of this in its topics. So just to comment on what you said about the First Coalition, following the execution of King Louis in 1793, France did declare war on Britain, and this period of the French Revolution was known as the War of the First Coalition. That lasted from 1792 to 97. And then later on, there was another war that followed in 1798 between the French army and Britain's Royal Navy in Egypt. And 1799, when Napoleon came to power, that became what was known as the Second Coalition that was led by Britain from 1798 to 1802. And then later on, in 1803, the next coalition, the War of the Third Coalition, was started, and that lasted until 1805. So there's obviously quite a bit going on between France and Britain in a short period of time. I mean, you're looking at the late 1700s going obviously all the way through these early 1800s if their war doesn't end until 1815. And I'm seeing now a list of some nations, and some you did mention. Italy is here, Germany, also Switzerland. Apparently there was some issues in Switzerland and involving troops from Switzerland and the Netherlands. And there's also more here on Russia, obviously talking about Napoleon's failed attempt to move into Russia during that very disastrous winter for his troops. So the period we are talking about, the 1812 to 1814-ish era, was actually known as the War of the Sixth Coalition, which started with that Russian invasion that you mentioned. And obviously this ended in 1814 with Napoleon's exile to Elba. And
wasn't it a temporary exile?
It was a temporary. Well, it was an exile, but he eventually escapes Elba, and that is when later on we see that Napoleon is defeated by British, Prussian, and Dutch forces at the Battle of Waterloo, here in June 1815, where we are now, looking at obviously a year after Britain takes its sights off of France and moves to America. So yeah, obviously, I mean, we always knew that Britain and France were constantly spread thin and constantly at war with each other. But even more so now, it seems like the end of the 1700s, beginning of the 1800s, was really just a jumbled up mess of multiple different wars and fronts between multiple different countries and allied groups. And, you know, obviously there's a short break here in 1814 as Napoleon is exiled to Elba, and Britain turns its sights on America.
Right, yeah.
So moving forward, we know Britain now has its eyes set on America. 1814, they are sailing for the American coast. We know that because of the events that happened, like you brought up, in York, at the fort of York, the dockyards, and then part of the town, American troops had attacked, raided, and burned down part of this town and the fort and whatnot, in order to lessen the hold on the trade port. And this was located in what is now present day Toronto. So we know it's very, very close to even now the present day British, Canadian, and American border. Following that, Britain decided in retaliation that they would start their invasion by attacking Washington, D.C. And after making landfall, British forces marched to D.C., but had to first travel through Bladensburg, which was a small town outside of D.C., where they were met by U.S. troop resistance. An interesting thing that many people don't know about this is that President Madison was actually in Bladensburg. So,
yeah, I always thought that was very interesting for him to be right there when the British show up.
right.
If I'm not mistaken, didn't they evacuate him straight to the White House?
Yeah, so that's kind of the next thing that I wanted to talk about is kind of the craziness that happened with the invasion of DC, because obviously everybody knows the story about James Madison leaving and then Dolly Madison staying to heroically save the portrait of George Washington,
Right.
and then obviously the burning down of the White House and things like that. But there's so much that was going on, and it's actually quite confusing if you don't really know a ton about it. So, before leaving the White House the first time to head for Bladensburg, James Madison asked his wife Dolly to gather up important state documents, and get them ready in case of defeat, so that they would be prepared to flee the White House. The morning, or rather the afternoon of August 23rd, so James Madison left August 22nd to head to Bladensburg. August 23rd, Dolly Madison and some of the White House servants stood on the roof of the president's mansion, because at the time it was not known as the White House, it was the president's mansion. But just for understanding, I'm going to continue addressing it as the White House. They stood on the roof of the White House looking through a spyglass to see British forces gathering. And in preparation for defeat, Dolly Madison decided to take the next step and start evacuating the White House. So she abandoned packing up any personal belongings of the Madison family. This included their family china, and turned her focus to gathering up important governmental and historical items. And obviously, we know some of these items were the state documents that her husband had asked her to gather. But one of these was a copy of the famous portrait, the famous full-body portrait of George Washington. This image hung in the president's mansion and was secured to the wall so tightly that she ordered the frame be broken and the portrait taken out, rolled up, and sent away for safekeeping until the British were no longer a threat to the capital.
From what I read, she just cut out the entire portrait out from the frame and then pretty much carried it off.
Yes.
Because she didn't have really much time getting the frame down, because it would have taken, from what I've been reading, it says it would have required the ladder to take it down. So she just pretty much, she cut around the whole thing, rolled up, and then got out of there as fast as she could before the British showed up.
Right. So, yep, she takes the photo, packs it up, she sends it away with who she, in her letters, describes as two gentlemen from New York. She does not actually even disclose their identity, and worries that this, letter would have been intercepted by British forces. She sends it away with these gentlemen from New York for safekeeping, and then she leaves the White House. Dolly Madison flees the White House on August 23rd. So, the battle at Bladensburg does not actually occur until the 24th. So Dolly Madison was gone by the time the battle occurred. So on August 24th, 6,000 U.S. troops in Bladensburg met the oncoming 4,500 British troops and tried to halt them from moving on to Washington, D.C. And what we know is that there were 3 lines of American troops set up on one side of a river. And over this river, there was a small bridge. So British troops had to cross this bridge, get set, and then fight the American troops on the other side, the 3 waves of American troops. And while they're doing this, more British troops are wading through the water of the river to reach the other side. So my question for you is, going into a battle like this, and we've definitely seen many battles where there is fighting done across rivers, what will the British have to be thinking? What's going through their generals' heads as they're walking up to this small bridge that they can maybe only fit a 3-row across soldiers battalion, lead a small battalion like that across the bridge? What are they thinking about setting up in order to take on this much, much larger force?
Well, the way I understand how wars were fought back then, you would have to have maybe artillery as backup. Not to mention they would have possibly better military training than American soldiers at the time. Because, like in the Revolution, we heavily relied on guerrilla tactics and a state militia. In this instance, like 20 to 30 years later, you would think in that time American soldiers would be properly trained to be ready for this kind of thing. But the way I see it is that the American army might have underestimated what they were fighting against. Maybe it's because they were too bold and thought, oh, we beat them in the Revolution, maybe we can kick them back out again. But they weren't prepared. Like, they were either not well equipped, nor were they properly trained.
Right.
So the way I see the British going through is that maybe they were thinking that these Americans did not have the time to properly prepare, because obviously, like we've been discussing, most of it was fought with naval ships.
Right.
And they didn't think they would send troops onto the mainland.
Right. And this was quick. I mean, we have to remember this is quick. The British made landfall in the American colonies, or well, rather the United States at this point, only a day or 2 prior to meeting this force in Bladensburg. And the other thing we have to remember is this was a naval force. Okay, this was this was British naval sailors and a small group of Marines that made up this army of 4,500 British troops. And you brought up having the cover of artillery. The British soldiers did have a newly designed form of rockets. And so they did have that cover, but they were also met on the other side of the river with artillery regiments of the American Army. So for this small group of British soldiers, who we know is a formidable force when meeting in line-to-line combat, to just keep on pushing, obviously that's nothing out of the ordinary for Britain. But what I find interesting and out of the ordinary for Britain, and this could possibly be just because of the war they had been engaged with in France and tactics beginning to change, is their separate battalions of soldiers wade through the river. That's very unlike the British Army that we saw in the Revolutionary War, who, would maybe send a large group of men across a bridge and then stop to get in lines nice and pretty and, take aim, fire. But for them to send their troops wading across a river to maybe, pick up that flank or attack that exposed side, that's very guerrilla-like for them. So are we seeing kind of an evolving British military style, or is it just kind of a fluke, spur of the moment thing that we see here, in your opinion?
In my opinion, yeah, I would very much say that the British military and how warfare was fought by them is starting to change at this point. Because obviously the years prior and maybe even sometime after, we see this kind of fighting, like men lined up with their muskets. Mm-hmm. They just take aim and fire. Mm-hmm. But the way they're doing this now is that maybe it's because they learned something from how the American soldiers fought in the Revolution. And they're using what they learned to change how they fought how they were fighting in the Revolution. Because the way I see it, they probably thought, since we lost the Revolution fighting this way, maybe we can fight this other kind of way that could, make a change and push further into American territory.
Right. And, the other thing, obviously we are going to see the Battle of Waterloo following the next year. So this will be in 1815. The Battle of Waterloo is fought. If we look at that battle map, we see that there is a lot more kind of, I guess we'll refer to it as guerrilla tactics set up there, because Napoleon, is set up in almost a circle formation so that they can defend from all sides. And yet we see the British forces not only attacking from all sides on this circle, but then they are moving troops around and slipping them in through these weak points to try and get in on that very similar guerrilla warfare, hide in the bushes, get up and close one-on-one fight, Mm-hmm. So I think I would definitely agree with you when you say that at this point we're definitely seeing a British army that is evolving. They're becoming more, I say more American, but I guess at this time we could even call it more modern, because that was kind of after America did it, it became kind of a modern form of warfare. I mean, we were not the only nation after the Revolution to fight in those guerrilla style tactics.
Right. That's
so
what I would definitely say.
Right. I definitely think we're seeing a change with the British Army here at this point. So moving on from that, with this battle, obviously the Americans were defeated. The Americans lost 50 men, and the rest of them retreated. During the retreat, the general informed James Madison, the president at the time, that they would be issuing a retreat. Immediately, President Madison, with an escort, makes his way back to Washington and to the presidential mansion, to the White House. The United States lost 50 soldiers. Britain lost 60 soldiers. After arriving back at the presidential mansion, James Madison gathers some final few items. He gets a fresh horse and leaves with an escort on August 24th. So it was obviously a very short distance from Bladensburg to Washington for the battle to commence, and the president to get back, the president to leave, and then for Britain to show up all on the same day. I mean, the president is there waiting for the battle to happen on August 24th. The battle happens August 24th. The battle ends August 24th. The president gets to the White House and has time to escape before the British show up on August 24th. This wasn't a multiple day occurrence, like most battles that we see. So
I just thought it was just so amazing that this could all happen in one day.
yeah, no, I agree. I mean, we even look at Yorktown, or for that matter, Waterloo. We see these battles that we in the modern day always assume that these battles, they happened one day and they ended. Like, oh, everybody, you had to stop and sleep at some point. That's kind of the ignorance of our mind in the modern day. But then you read about it and you realize, oh no, these battles lasted full weeks. Single battles that lasted full weeks, taking and defending the same exact positions, and so for a battle like this, obviously it's small numbers and small forces, but for even a battle like this to end so quickly, to me that shows that Britain knew what they wanted and they were pushing through.
Oh yeah, they were just mowing down.
Yeah. So moving on from that, obviously battle ends. James Madison leaves. Dolly Madison's already gone with the portrait of President Washington safely in tow. At 6 p.m. on August 24th, the British arrived in D.C. The first thing the British did was they marched on the Capitol building. They broke down the doors. They broke inside. And what we know is that some documents and artifacts were taken by the British government, or rather the British Army, but then they set fire to the building by means of the Senate chambers, which now in the modern day we refer to as the old Senate chambers, because though the old Senate chambers is still standing, the Senate no longer meets in those chambers.
Yeah.
After burning down the Capitol building, or rather setting fire to the Capitol building, they began moving on to other buildings. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, you're fine. I was going to also say, there's a bunch of other, federal buildings that they targeted. I think they targeted the Department of the Treasury building.
Right. Yes. So after they set fire to the Capitol, they move on to the White House. As they're moving on to the White House, it's important to note, though, that U.S. troops who still occupied the Naval Yard set fire to the Naval Yard. So obviously, for those who don't know, a Naval Yard is where warships were built and set out to sea and commission. The Naval Yard was burned down by U.S. troops, and 2 brand new warships that had just been finished were also set on fire and sunk so that British troops could not take, the war supplies and the armaments.
The way I see it, this was pretty much a scorched earth policy of the British.
Mm-hmm.
Just burn everything down.
Right. And obviously, we would say that this was a smart move on behalf of the U.S. troops. I mean, burning down 2 brand new warships, 2 brand new fully armed warships that could have possibly gone into British hands and only increased their navy, which was, like you said, already getting stronger at this time. I mean, that was a very good strategic move on behalf of the American citizens. So like you said, they did move on to some other federal buildings, but first they stopped at the White House. They busted down the doors of the White House and broke in to find that the table had been set for dinner by the servants before they were evacuated. Obviously, when James Madison showed back up at the White House and was quickly gathering things so that he could escape himself, that was when the servants, I'm sure, took the hint that it's time to go. But that wasn't before the table had been set for that evening's dinner. So the British soldiers took it upon themselves to have a seat at that table at the White House and eat the president's dinner on the Madison.
Yeah, I was gonna
yes.
mention that. I thought that was hilarious that they just take out at the president's table.
Well, I mean, we got to remember now these guys have been marching for multiple days. Like 1 or 2 days they marched to get to Bladensburg. They fought a war, or rather a battle. They marched to DC. They broke in and have now set fire to the Capitol building. They've marched all the way across, town to the White House. If I were one of those British sailors, and God knows they probably did not have, God knows they probably did not have a ton to eat on the voyage over, for that matter. I don't blame them.
I wouldn't either.
Right. So they sit down, they eat this meal using the president's china and the president's silverware before they set fire to the presidential mansion. After setting fire to the president's mansion, they do move on to burn down the Treasury and the U.S. War Office.
Right.
So what's important here, and something that I really wanted to bring up, was the fact that U.S. forces, or I'm sorry, not U.S. forces, the fires that the British forces set were so hot that it actually melted some of the marble at the different buildings. So obviously we know the White House at this time was a large marble building, and even the Capitol building was a large marble building. But we have to remember the inside of these buildings was many times, very old, dried out wood. You have, plaster walls or, wooden walls with highly flammable paints and cloth decorations and furniture and wood floors, books, all these things. Those fires became so hot that in certain sections of the buildings, including the Capitol building, the marble literally melted and was reduced to lime. In fact, the Senate chambers were so destroyed, Senate was no longer able to meet at the Capitol building. And major restorations had to undergo to the building before they could meet there again. And they say that the reason for this is because actually in the Capitol building at the time, in the Senate chambers, was where the Library of Congress was held. And so when those books caught fire, along with the obviously wooden floors and furniture and everything else, it caused that fire to get so hot it literally melted the walls. And obviously that happened similarly to certain sections of the White House. So it's incredible, really, to me, that even the buildings are still standing. But the reason they're still standing is actually even more fascinating and coincidental. And it's a story that has kind of been over-exaggerated over the years, just like any other story. So a major storm had been moving in during this whole day. Okay, so August 24th, a major storm had been moving in to Washington, D.C. And over the years, this has gone from being a severe thunderstorm to now a major hurricane. And
yeah, and I also read something that like a tornado came in from the west.
Right, yeah, and I don't know what the actual factuality of that is. But when I first heard this story, it was something similar. A tornado or a massive hurricane had come through and basically chased the British out of Washington and set the fires out. And I don't know what is true or not about the tornado, but I know that we have documentation from firsthand accounts of, citizens from DC or British soldiers, things like that, that as the British were leaving DC, a severe thunderstorm swept through and basically extinguished the fires that had been set. So this these severely hot fires that were able to melt marble, you know, were put out, and it pretty much saved the city and the monuments that were still there. And so the Americans, from what I understand, kind of took this as a sign from God that, that they would be victorious over the British. God was on their side because he stopped the burning of their capital. So my question there to you is, do we see kind of examples of natural disasters and things like that happening elsewhere in history, not even just U.S. history, if you have an example, that forces took that as a sign from God that they were destined for victory?
Not that I can really come across any big examples. But maybe even the Spanish Civil War, when it was Francisco Franco and his, well, I want to say posse, but I will say army of loyal nationalists against the Republican army that was backed by the Russians and other like-minded communists. I want to say that there was one point in the Civil War, it was like right in the middle of it, that the nationalists were losing, but then like some natural phenomenon happened, and I think it destroyed like a camp of Spanish Republican soldiers, and it also damaged the Capitol in a Capitol building in Madrid. I'm not entirely sure, but I'll have to look more into it.
Yeah.
But I think the nationalists took that as a sign that they will win this war. And that's when, like, I think Mussolini and Hitler start sending, like, equipment, weapons, and even volunteer troops to fight against the Republicans.
Yeah, and I know just from my own studies that, there were some other examples that came to mind when I heard about this. One of them was during the time of Tecumseh and his brother, the Prophet, and their kind of, I want to call it a rebellion against, obviously, what we consider to be, like the European man and colonists. The story that I had always heard, and I've read it a couple times in some different biographies or textbooks, and I've never known what the full truth of it was, but that there was a solar eclipse, and so the people fighting with Tecumseh believed that that was a sign from the gods that they would be victorious. And obviously we see that they ended up not being victorious, and it was a terrible defeat. But I definitely think, obviously now in the modern day, we don't really consider phenomenons like that to be signs from a deity or anything like that. But it was a completely different period in the 17 and 1800s, a period that was still very strongly ruled by religion and faith and things like that. And obviously we did go through that Enlightenment period where the world started to move away from that all throughout the mid to late 1700s, even going as far as the early to mid 1800s.
I certainly agree with that. Because the majority of countries that have fought in wars throughout these periods of time, they all thought they were doing God's work. Especially during the colonial period, when powers of Britain, Spain, France, and even Portugal were going out into the New World colonizing, and they all thought that going to war with these indigenous people, not to mention slaughtering them or converting them to Christianity, was God's will. It's basically the same theme that we see in the 19th century in America with Manifest Destiny.
Right.
That's what I think all of this is about. It's Manifest Destiny for everything.
Right. I had not even taken the idea of Manifest Destiny into account. That's definitely a interesting topic in itself. The whole idea behind Manifest Destiny. That started long before any idea of independence. That started far back into even just when it was monarchies across, the world fighting for control around them.
Right.
There's even examples of Manifest Destiny, though it had not received that name yet, as far back as, the 14 and 1500s, and even earlier. So my whole reason for covering this today, just specifically this part of the War of 1812, with the little backstory that it had, was because this was the last time that the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. had fallen under siege. And obviously, it has now happened for a second time, having now experienced this past week the events that occurred when protesters broke down the door, or broke through the doors and broke out windows, and invaded the Capitol.
Of course.
Obviously, this was a very hard-hitting moment for a lot of us. This was a very the word I'm looking for is not coming to mind. I guess I want to say not necessarily gut-wrenching, but it was a very gut-wrenching moment for many Americans, including myself. And I was just curious, do you draw any similarities between the events that happened this past week with what I have now been seeing called the Save America invasion, and the Battle of D.C. in 1814?
Well, obviously one similarity is it's rather obvious. The Capitol is under siege, but see it done by your own people. It's just it would make the people back then really shake their heads at it, because it's Americans that are sieging the Capitol building and causing this much chaos. But the way I see it, there was possibly some intent to maybe even burn down the building, because I know some reports said that there were people that there was one person that carried a pipe bomb, and a few others had Molotov cocktails.
Mm-hmm.
So that tells me that they were trying to repeat what the British did in the War of 1812.
I would have to say I agree with you on that. I know exactly the report you're talking about. I recently have been going through different arrest reports and the mortuary reports and things for those that died. And speaking of that, our prayers go out to all the service members who were injured or lost their lives, as well as the press or political families, anybody who was affected by this. This was a terrible, terrible thing to happen. But I know exactly what report it is you're talking about, and the gentleman that was found with the pipe bomb and arrested was also found in possession of, I think the article read, 11 Molotov cocktails in a backpack. And now with the fallout from this, we have been discovering other pipe bombs. I know there was a pipe bomb that was left in the Senate chambers when they went through and were scanning before Senate reconvened. I know that they found pipe bombs outside of the RNC and the DNC, and that there were also pipe bombs outside of the U.S. Mint that's in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
So
that's another interesting thing. Like, why would they want to attack? Well, I can understand why they would want to have pipe bombs at the DNC, but for the RNC too, that's just really interesting to draw some conclusions on.
Well, I get where you're going with that, because the people who were protesting were in line with the candidate of the RNC. Is that what you?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not entirely sure of that myself, and obviously this was something that was a little bit more planned out than what any of us thought at first. And I've seen a lot of people drawing comparisons with 9/11 to this event, as nobody knew what was going on when the first plane hit. They didn't know what was happening. They thought it was an accident. And then the second plane hit, and everybody knew exactly what was going on. And then the plane went down in the Pennsylvania field, and then a plane hit the Pentagon. And all this information started coming out, and new things, were discovered, and everybody started to realize that this was a lot more planned out in depth than what anybody had thought before.
Right. And that's why, like, you get the FBI and the NSA coming in. They're leading the investigations on it.
Right.
You just find so much. They just find so much of, like, how this was all being planned. And, like, I know I read one that a West Virginia lawmaker was arrested for being part of the plotting to burn the Capitol.
Yeah, actually, I was just discussing that with somebody. Sorry, my mic has some interference going on there again. Let me see if I can get that worked out. Oh, there we go. Yeah, I was just discussing that myself with someone, that newly elected representative for West Virginia, Derek Evans, I think was his name. He had been present and filming and involved in the storming of the Capitol building. And what's even more interesting is he was at his mother's house. His mother had been watching his children. He was at his mother's house when the FBI showed up and knocked on the door to arrest him. So, yeah. So imagine going to pick up your kids from grandma's, and FBI knocks on grandma's door and says, we're arresting your son.
I would be freaking out at that point.
Yeah. So yeah, that was my big reason for wanting to go over this today, was because of the events that had just happened. And obviously it is the second time in history that this has happened to our Capitol building, to our Capitol in general. So I thought it was something fitting and important to go over it this time.
Oh yeah, very fitting. I thought, because when you first originally came to me with this idea, I immediately thought that there's really some big similarities that we can draw to,
right,
on how the British burning down the Capitol building is similar to what happened,
right,
in the recent weeks.
Right. Well, thank you for coming on the podcast today. I definitely will be asking you back in the future for some of those topics we discussed, including the Spanish-American War. But thank you for making yourself available and joining me today on the show. It was very, very helpful, very, very informative on a lot of these topics.
Yeah, I'm glad I could be here. Thank you for having me.
So everybody, that was Cole Holliday, a future historian in the making, soon to be history graduate from Holy Cross College in Notre Dame, Indiana. And you just finished listening to our discussion on the War of 1812 and the events that happened in D.C. If you'd like to hear more content like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button. the like button and that notification bell so you can get updates on when we post new content. I'm hoping to get more guest stars to come in and help host this show, and we will definitely be hearing from Cole again in the future. So once again, thanks for tuning in. Make sure you follow us, make sure you hit the notification button, and tune in next time for more content on politics, history, and soon to be other topics. Everybody stay healthy and safe.